We're going to finish off our lecture on ethics today by talking about algorithmic bias and the effect of technology on our political system and on elections. So what is bias? Bias is actually a mathematical term, and you'll hear it come up if you ever take a machine learning class. And the bias of some estimation procedure is the expected value of the prediction minus the truth. And so really you can think about that as the average of the prediction minus the truth. It's basically how far off your estimate is from the reality on average. And by the way, estimation procedure. You can think about machine learning in general as given some data, you want to predict something. And so the estimation procedure is using your machine learning algorithm to try to predict something given some value, some set of values, some data. A good example of this is house prices. If you have a big table of all of the house prices for the city of Washington, D.C., and in that table, for each house, you have the size of the house, the number of square feet, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, the coordinates for that house, etc., etc. And then you have the price also for each house. Well, using that table, you can then go and generate the price, the expected price of a new house that you add where you don't know its actual price. So you could take a look and create a table with all of the houses that have been sold in the last year, and then use machine learning to then come up with the price for some new house that's about to go on sale and estimate the price. And this is how sites like Zillow work. And again, if bias is how far off from the actual truth the predicted value is on average, the way this comes up and affects society is when we have bias in our predictions, because the training data that we use is not representative of the population to which that prediction is applied. And so kind of example of this we'll see in a minute. But really what I want you to think about is how when we do machine learning, the data that we use to create our algorithm, the data that we look through, that our algorithm looks through to predict some values, it has to be representative of the actual population. Because if it isn't, and then you try to use it on all people, then your algorithm doesn't have enough information to try to come up with the right answers. And so you get some amount of bias. Now, where has this actually come up in the real world? Well, for example, let's think about Amazon. So Amazon has over 1 million employees. It's a little crazy. When you think about it, they have some number of engineers and they're doing all that, but they have just all of the workers in the warehouses. They have pilots that are flying planes, all the delivery people. And just in the last year, because of COVID, they've hired something like 400,000 people. But think about how many applications that takes. So to process all of their applications, it's nearly impossible for a person to go through them. So they built a machine learning recruiting tool. And this tool would go through and take a first pass and score applicants, and the full details aren't available, but these scores are then used to decide who to potentially hire. And there's this article talking about what happened with this algorithm. I'll read from here. But by 2015, the company realized its new system was not rating candidates for software developer jobs and other technical posts in a gender-neutral way. That's because Amazon's computer models were trained to vet applicants by observing patterns in resumes submitted to the company over a 10-year period. Here's the kicker, the important part. Most came from men, a reflection of male dominance across the tech industry. And so, yes, if you look backwards in history, there are certain biases. And by building an algorithm based on just their past hires, well, in the past, Amazon has hired more men than women for their software engineering roles. Without being careful, this leads the algorithm to believe that, well, if I have a guy and a girl applying for the same job that are otherwise equal, well, the algorithm has seen more men, and so Maybe it gives a higher score to men. This is really problematic because now our algorithm, or Amazon's hiring algorithm, recruiting tool algorithm here, is biased towards men against women because there have been more men in the past. And so we have to be very intentional in the data that we use to train our algorithm to make sure that it reflects what we actually want to hire and looks at the right attributes of people. So here, this will be our discussion question for today in class. Think a little bit about what these machine learning algorithms should be allowed to do. Do you think they should be restricted from making particular types of decisions like hiring or sentencing? And do you think these algorithms are more or less fair than humans? Because I'll throw out the thought to you, humans are not impartial. Resume reviewers can be just as biased. It's just much harder to investigate them. And so are machine learning algorithms really the best way because they're more impartial? Or is it bad that they're still biased? Now, finally, we're going to talk about political campaigns and polarization. Think about how technology has affected who we've been electing. There's this author, Nicholas Carr, and he has a model and a theory on how technology has induced 3 distinct phase shifts. And the first piece of technology that came out was radio. And with radio, before candidates would be either speaking in person or writing in newspapers, but radio disembodied the candidates. They're just voices. So kind of big, bombastic rhetoric that we hear now much more in politics would sound not great when it would be played on the radio in a living room or in a kitchen or in a family house. Then came the era of TV, and that disruption gave our politicians bodies back. And so now you have something else. You have kind of, what does my candidate look like and how do they carry themselves? How do they hold themselves? Image is super important. And does that candidate seem weak or do they seem nervous? Or are they sweating during a presidential debate, which was something that could be looked at on TV. And now finally we're in this era of social media and the internet. And now the thing that spreads the most on the social media is how fiery and oftentimes populist the message is. And even inflammatory, because that is what is most worthy of attention. From the people that believe it, they all share it. And the people that are against it, they also all share it. And so that is the kind of content that goes viral, that spreads. And so those are the candidates that get brought to the forefront. But it's more than that. Technology, we'll think a little bit about how technology factors in here, but we're at an insane amount of polarization. These are kind of distributions of how, I believe this is how Democrats and Republicans rated themselves of how liberal or conservative. Actually, I think this one actually might be where they took a questionnaire. And notice just that the distribution of Democrats and the distribution of Republicans overlapped quite a bit here in 1973. See the distribution right here, we have some overlap. Whereas as we move further on, in 1993, we now see a distinct separation of these two curves, and barely any overlap. Just the most conservative of the Democrats overlapped with the most liberal of the conservatives. And now finally, looking in 2011, we're down to no overlap whatsoever in people's beliefs. And so the Democrats are their complete own category, and the Republicans are their complete own category. Here, this is another graph, and there's some links for where this comes from. This says what percent of Democrats thought of Republicans as very unfavorable. And so in 1994, you can see Democrats, 16% of Democrats thought Republicans were very unfavorable. Same thing over here, 17% the other way. Republicans thought about Democratic Party. But notice, as we get to 2004, Democrats, nearly a third of Democrats think that Republicans are very unfavorable. And vice versa here at 21%. And finally, going up to 2014, and probably even more so now, 38% of Democrats and 43% of Republicans said that they view the other party as very unfavorable. And this statistic is crazy. 27% of Democrats see the Republican Party as a fundamental threat to the nation's well-being. And same thing, 36% of Republicans think that about the Democratic Party. So we just see this further pulling apart of society where the people on either sides of this kind of debate and these political ideas increasingly see the opposite side as just not being able to fit into what they see the nation to be and what they want the nation to be. This kind of continues on. You can see more also layering apart of Republicans and Democrats. And same thing here, this issue polarization. You just notice how these lines of belief. So this is saying what percent say that stricter environmental laws and regulations are worth the cost. You can see before it was kind of close in the late 90s and early 2000s. But we see starting in around 2008, you see this layering where Democrats go up, Republicans go down, and the difference is bigger. Same thing about immigrants. It's not the particular ideas that are important, it's the difference in the percent of people in each party that believe some particular idea. And we'll wrap up here to say, I'll leave you with this discussion question. Do you think that modern technologies reduce or increase exposure to differing opinions? And does this have a positive, negative, or insignificant effect on people's personal beliefs in society at large? And finally, do you think this is what's driving polarization? Because this previous slide I just skipped over talks a little bit about this, how information, it consumes attention of its recipients. And so when you have too much information, a wealth of information, it creates a scarcity of attention. And so now you have to figure out how to allocate your attention. And Vanessa Otero here, this is a quote from her about how even though we have so much information available to us, the problem is some information is good and some information is bad. And so it's not that easy to tell them apart sometimes. And there's so much information. And perhaps this is what's driving us to such a polarized state. So we'll stop there and I will see you in class for discussion on this. Bye.